Hello and welcome to Team Peachtree and the final leg of this epic journey from Magellan's Fleet. There's only one ship left, the Victoria, and she's going to set sail via the Indian Ocean route. She's going to be going home, starting that trip on the 21st of December, 1521. She'll be commanded by Juan Sebastian Elcano. That ship has had so many different captains. And then by 6th of May, 1522, the Victoria rounded the Cape of Good Hope. And by that stage, they only had rice for rations. It was a little bit like Survivor. And so during that period between December and May, around about 5 months, there were raging storms. The Cape of Good Hope is also sometimes called the Cape of Storms. And headwinds broke one of Victoria's masts. So they really limped into that particular area. Also, 20 crewmen died of starvation by 9 July 1522 when Elcano put into a Portuguese occupied Cape Verde Islands for provisions. And you can imagine, because they passed by the Portuguese occupied parts of Mozambique, which is right next to South Africa, the fact that they went into the harbor at Cape Verde basically meant that they had no choice. They were desperate. And so there was a surprise waiting for them there, and the surprise was that the crew learned that the date was actually 10 July 1522. And this is also what's so incredible. Despite all the argy-bargy, despite battles and disease and mutiny and raging storms and St. Elmo's fire and everything else, they actually kept a meticulous record of how many, what day it was. And so their own meticulous records were showing that it was a day later. How did that happen? They had no trouble making purchases at first in the Cape Verde Islands, and they used kind of a cover story saying that they were returning to Spain from the Americas. But when the Portuguese detained 13 crew members, they did that after finding out that the Victoria was carrying spices, and those could only have come from the East Indies, which is sort of Portuguese territory. Now, how could you have gotten to Portuguese territory without going via the route monopolized by the Portuguese, which is via the Atlantic? And so, in an incredible sort of drama, the crew of the Victoria managed to escape with its cargo of 26 tons of spices. That's cloves and cinnamon. That was what this whole adventure was all about. Getting spices back to Europe. And so then it happened on the 6th of September, 1522.
Something's
right? So approximately, 2.5 months after arriving at the Verde Islands, Elcano and the remaining crew of what used to be Magellan's fleet of 5 ships arrived at Sanlúcar de Barrameda in Spain aboard the Victoria. And can you imagine what that feeling must have felt like? It must have felt like they'd run 1,000 marathons, right? They'd done 100 Ironmans back to back. And after everything they'd been through, all the giants, all the strange people, all the strange creatures, the goose that you had to skin, which is a penguin, the camels without humps, which were llamas, all these strange creatures that they'd encountered. Yeah, they were back on home soil. And the men on board that ship were sort of imbued with an incredible knowledge that the world is incredibly vast. And I think there are very few people, even in the modern world, who get to go around the world in a single process. And so once they arrived in Spain, they then sailed upriver to Seville, and then from there they went overland, obviously loading the spices onto wagons and hauling them up to Valladolid, where they appeared before the emperor. And you can imagine the emperor was probably pretty pleased. And scientists and learned folks were probably pretty interested in what they had to say, and it probably made the equivalent of news headlines. They would be heroes, the talk of the town. And so thus Victoria, one of the smallest vessels of the fleet, became the first vessel to make a full circuit of the planet, of planet Earth. And this happened 5 centuries, 500 years ago, last fall. She also proved at last that the Earth was round. And the first account of Magellan's journey to appear in print was this. And so let's now deal with the aftermath. About 3 years after Victoria returned, Charles IV sent another expedition to occupy the Moluccas, including the former captain, Elcano. And, after having done so much, survived so much, seen so much, well, he didn't survive that expedition. You can see there's an incredible attrition rate to these sort of ultra-long distance voyages. By the time the Spanish got back to the Moluccas, the Portuguese, their old foes that were already there, and they were also putting their Carrack fleets to work at world conquest. There was the sense of just how big the world was. Well, let's get busy conquering. And so for a decade, both empires squabbled over territories in the east before deciding that Portugal would take Malacca and Spain the Philippines. During Magellan's incredible journey, they encountered animals they had never seen before, that had never been seen by European eyes at all. Think about all the creatures of the Galapagos Islands, these, I think they called them dragons, water dragons, these big lizards that swim in the sea, and so many other creatures, giant tortoises and so on. And then what about the Victoria? Think about today the space shuttle. You can go and see it in a museum. Where can people go and see the Victoria today? Well, how about this? The Victoria was repaired after her circuit around the world, and then she was bought by another merchant shipper, and she continued to sail for another 50 years. Quite an incredible vessel, wasn't she? And so is it a happily ever after for Victoria? Did she sort of end up in some sort of quiet lagoon somewhere, celebrated, treated like gold, treated like this incredible object of human achievement? Well, in 1570, during a trip from the Antilles, that's near Cuba and the Cayman Islands, which is not that far from Florida, she was on her way back to Seville. Victoria was lost at sea with all hands. So there's not even a plank, not even a splinter of that incredible ship that is available to see anywhere. That ship is somewhere at the bottom of the Atlantic, lost. Today we take for granted our knowledge that the world is round and that the scale and scope of the Pacific, through the detailed GPS navigational maps that we have at our beck and call on little magic wands called smartphones. But it was not always so. We think what we know has always been known, and that man has always had mastery over his domain. Not at all. Magellan's voyage was actually a catastrophe, and were it not for the likes of Pigafetta chronicling all of these events, reducing 3 years to a detailed narrative, much of it would be like saying, that saying, if a tree falls in a forest and no one sees it, did it really happen? So it's really thanks to that chronicle that the rest of the world were able to learn the lessons from what was out there, because it was a big unknown world. And through that carefully kept record, other people, other sailors, other expeditions, other adventurers were able to avoid the pitfalls that ended up being the hard lessons that this crew had to go through. The fate of Victoria also tells us a little or a lot about how poor human beings are at recognizing their own milestones. In 1570, the Victoria was still plying the Atlantic, still undertaking vast, strenuous voyages, and probably one of the most famous ships, probably more deserving of fame than the Titanic, perhaps as deserving as the Apollo 11, until, as I say, she disappeared without a trace. She probably encountered one mid-Atlantic storm too many and sank. And who knows, maybe some sort of mushy remains of wood is still down there. Some kind of pile of rotting wood is still down there. Who knows? But think about it. Think about Pigafetta as a great chronicler. And then they let this incredible ship out of their reach, out of their memories. One of the most remarkable achievements in human history, and not a waterlogged plank or splinter to show for it. It is also quite remarkable that just 5 short centuries ago, our species had no freaking idea the world was round. Well, some people did, and our maps were a mess. 500 years ago, our maps were absolute chaos. This distorted morass of, funnily shaped things that bore no resemblance to the actual Earth. And so look where we are now. We've come a long way in 500 years, yes. But the voyage of Victoria is a reminder that we need to stay humble. We need to work together, because sometimes, often, we are our own worst enemy. Not the elements, though they can be. Not disease, though affliction is always possible. Not starvation or poverty or war, although these are out there too. No, the greatest peril isn't the unknown, it's us, and the appetites we carry with us wherever we go. The fears, the irrational fears, and to some extent the rational fears. Can we overcome them? In his book, Over the Edge of the World, Magellan's Terrifying Circumnavigation of the Globe, published in 2003, Lawrence Begg-Green describes little Victoria leaving a wordless epitaph written on the restless waves. Perhaps that unspoken, unmapped end is appropriate after all. Sometimes, often, great things have small beginnings.
You'll have to manage without pocket handkerchiefs and a good many other things, Bilbo Baggins, before we reach our journey's end. You were born to the rolling hills and little rivers of the Shire. But home is now behind you. The world is ahead.
Keep weaving, and I'll see you guys next time.